What if I told you Illinois had a serial killer operating a murder hotel with a built-in crematorium right next to a World's Fair? That Chicago's entire downtown secretly flooded from tunnels nobody remembered existed? And that one politician secretly moved a state border in the middle of the night, giving Illinois a city that was supposed to be in Wisconsin? That's Illinois. And we found 71 facts about it that will break your brain completely. Hype this video up right now. One tap, and you become the reason someone's mind gets blown today. Let's go! 1. Illinois has sent 4 of its own governors to federal prison since 1973, and nobody in the state seems particularly shocked about it anymore. 4 governors, 4 separate FBI investigations, 4 separate trials, 4 separate convictions. Political scientists studying government corruption across all 50 states have run the numbers multiple times and keep arriving at the same uncomfortable conclusion that Illinois is, statistically, the most corrupt state government in American history per capita. The governors just kept getting elected anyway. 2. In the 1850s, engineers looked at Chicago's downtown district, decided the entire street grid was sitting too low, and came up with a plan to physically lift every building 4 to 14 feet higher using thousands of jack screws simultaneously. The truly remarkable part was that nobody asked residents or business owners to leave during the process. People stayed inside their buildings, went about their daily lives, and were slowly lifted into the air while the city restructured itself underneath them without closing for a single day. 3. Illinois made history in 1923 by officially declaring that its residents do not speak English. The state legislature passed a law declaring the official state language to be American, not English, and nobody successfully challenged it for 46 years. Citizens filed paperwork, signed documents, attended school, and conducted official government business in a language the state had legally decided to call something else entirely. The law sat quietly on the books until 1969, when someone finally got around to fixing it. 4. Ulysses S. Grant was living in Galena, Illinois in 1860, working behind a counter in his family's leather goods shop, earning a salary that barely covered his basic expenses. He was a West Point graduate with military experience who had quietly failed at nearly everything he had attempted in civilian life. 1 year later, he was commanding Union armies across multiple states. 2 years after that, he was the most powerful military figure in the entire country. The leather shop never put up a sign. 5. Illinois' deadliest single-day disaster had nothing to do with fire, flood, or storm. In 1915, a steamship called the Eastland was fully loaded with passengers and still tied to its own dock in the Chicago River when it simply rolled over onto its side. The water was only 20 feet deep. The dock was right there. 844 people drowned anyway within under 20 minutes, while bystanders on the riverbank watched from just a few feet away completely helpless. 6. Most Americans picture cornfields in Chicago when they think of Illinois, and completely miss the fact that the southern tip of the state is geologically a different world entirely. The region locals call Little Egypt sits on the same soil composition and fault line system as Mississippi and Louisiana. The landscape looks nothing like Chicago, the culture sounds nothing like Chicago, and the people there will tell you directly that they have far more in common with the Deep South than with anything happening up north. 7. The town of Kaskaskia was once the first capital of Illinois, a functioning government seat with buildings, residents, and official state business being conducted inside its borders. Then the Mississippi River quietly decided to shift its course permanently, and the river moved. When it settled into its new path, Kaskaskia was no longer connected to Illinois at all. The town ended up stranded on the wrong side of the Mississippi, physically separated from its own state, where it technically remains to this day. 8. An Illinois politician named Nathaniel Pope walked into Congress in 1818 with a very specific and quiet request. He wanted the northern border of Illinois moved 51 miles further north before statehood was finalized. Congress reviewed it, approved it without significant debate, and moved the line. Nobody fully appreciated what had just happened until much later. That single border adjustment placed a stretch of Lake Michigan shoreline inside Illinois instead of Wisconsin. That shoreline is where Chicago was eventually built. One man moved a line and created a city. 9. Illinois spent over $73 million designing, planning, and constructing a brand new state prison facility during the 1990s. Workers finished the building on schedule. Inspectors signed off on the construction. The prison sat fully built, fully equipped, and completely ready to receive inmates. Then, the state looked at its budget, realized it had no money left to actually hire the staff required to run the facility, and left the entire prison sitting empty for years without a single prisoner ever being placed inside it. 10. In 1943, a Chicago pizzeria owner named Ike Sewell ran short of regular pizza dough during a busy service and made a desperate decision to press thicker dough into a deep pan and keep the kitchen moving. Customers received something they had never seen before and ordered it again the next week. Sewell never went back to the original thin version because the new one was outselling everything else on the menu. That single inventory shortage accidentally created Chicago deep dish pizza and started a debate that has never ended. 11. Illinois Governor George Ryan ran a scheme so casually corrupt that truck drivers across the state were purchasing their commercial licenses without taking any tests whatsoever, simply paying the right people and driving away legally certified. The arrangement hummed along quietly until one of those unqualified drivers caused a crash that killed 6 children from the same family in a single accident. The FBI opened an investigation the following week, and Ryan eventually went to federal prison for racketeering. 12. Beneath the streets of Chicago sits a secret freight tunnel network stretching 60 miles in total length that was built in 1899 to move coal and packages between downtown buildings without clogging street traffic above. It operated for decades, then quietly fell out of use, and was eventually forgotten so completely that most city officials stopped thinking about it entirely. In 1992, a construction crew accidentally breached the tunnel wall and millions of gallons of Chicago River water poured into basements across the entire downtown core simultaneously. 13. The city of Joliet, Illinois, has an ordinance on its books making it technically illegal to mispronounce the city's name in certain contexts, and locals have actually attempted to enforce this against confused tourists passing through. On visitors who arrive saying Joliet instead of the correct Geological, find themselves on the receiving end of corrections that go well beyond friendly local guidance. The law exists. Joliet residents are aware of it. They are not particularly apologetic about how seriously they take their city's name. 14. John Dillinger spent years robbing banks across multiple states, evading federal agents, escaping from jails, and becoming the most wanted criminal in America before the FBI. I finally caught up with him outside the Biograph Theater in Chicago on a warm July evening in 1934. Agents shot him on the sidewalk as he walked out after watching a movie. Within hours of his death, the exact spot where he fell had already become a tourist attraction with strangers walking over specifically to see where Public Enemy No. 1 took his last steps. 15. Illinois entered the Civil War on the Union side as a free state and supplied more soldiers to the Union Army than almost any other northern state. Simultaneously, active pro-slavery newspapers were operating openly inside its borders. Confederate spies were being sheltered by sympathetic residents, and state legislators came genuinely close to passing a law that would have made it illegal for any black person to enter Illinois at all. The state was fighting for the Union with one hand and debating apartheid with the other. 16. Chicago was not built on solid ground and has never pretended otherwise. Now the entire city sits on soft clay deposited over what was once a vast swamp. And that clay compresses measurably every single decade under the weight of the buildings pressing down on it. Engineers have been designing foundations, installing drainage systems, and fighting the slow sinking of the city since construction first began. The ground keeps winning. Chicago keeps building anyway, and the engineers keep showing up to work every morning. 17. Cairo. Illinois sits at the exact point where the Ohio River meets the Mississippi River, a geographic position that 19th century investors and city planners unanimously agreed made it destined to become the largest and most powerful city in all of America. Railroads were planned around it. Fortunes were invested into it. Futures were staked on it. Cairo today has fewer than 1,800 residents, rows of collapsed and abandoned buildings lining its streets, and the quiet atmosphere of a place that understood very early that destiny had changed its mind. 18. A bakery supplier named James Dewar was working in an Illinois snack factory in 1930 trying to figure out what to do with shortcake pans that sat completely idle during the months when strawberry season was over. He filled them with a cheap banana cream filling, created a new product, and named it after a billboard he saw on his drive to work. The Twinkie was born entirely out of an effort to keep equipment from sitting unused. Then, wartime banana rationing arrived, vanilla replaced banana, and customers liked the new version even more than the original. 19. Illinois was the very first state in the entire country to ratify the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, abolishing slavery in February of 1865, moving faster than every other state to put its official approval on the most important legal document of the era. Then, Illinois went home and kept its own black codes in place, a collection of state laws restricting where black residents could live, work, travel, and exist within Illinois borders, laws that remained active on the books for decades after the amendment was ratified. 20. Every person who has ever called Chicago the Windy City because of its weather has been operating on completely false information. The nickname was coined by a New York newspaper editor in the 1880s as a political insult directed at Chicago politicians he considered full of hot air and endless empty boasting. Now, it had nothing to do with Lake Michigan wind, nothing to do with weather patterns, and nothing to do with climate data. Chicago heard the insult, decided it sounded impressive, and adopted it as a compliment without hesitation. 21. Rod Blagojevich was the sitting governor of Illinois and was fully aware that federal investigators were circling his administration when he picked up his phone and began making the calls that would end his career. The FBI had already placed an active wiretap on his line. Blagojevich knew investigations were happening and kept calling anyway, day after day, saying extraordinarily incriminating things into a phone he had every reason to believe was being monitored. Agents listened, recorded everything, and eventually had more material than they needed for a conviction. 22. The 1893 Chicago World's Fair attracted millions of visitors from across the globe and generated so much excitement and foot traffic that a man named H.H. Holmes decided it was the perfect business opportunity. He built a hotel directly next door to the fairgrounds and designed it himself with hidden gas lines running into guest rooms, secret passages built into the walls, and a private crematorium installed in the basement. Holmes used the hotel specifically to kill guests. Authorities eventually estimated he murdered somewhere between 27 and 200 people inside it. 23. Chicago passed a law in 1871, making it officially illegal to eat inside any establishment that is currently on fire. The law sounds absurd until you consider that it was passed immediately after the Great Chicago Fire tore through the city and strongly implies that at least one documented incident occurred during that disaster, where a person sat at a table, watched flames spreading toward them, and made the personal decision that finishing their meal was the more pressing priority before evacuating the burning building around them. 24. Ronald Reagan was born in 1911 in a tiny apartment situated directly above a bakery in Tampico, Illinois, a small town that most Americans could not locate on a map without assistance. His family had very little money and moved from rental to rental 6 separate times before Reagan had finished elementary school. Why, the boy who grew up moving between small Illinois towns with almost nothing, eventually became the 41st president of the United States. The bakery beneath his birthplace apartment is still there today. 25. In 1909, a fire broke out inside the cherry mine in Bureau County, Illinois, and spread through the underground tunnels faster than the 500 miners and young boys working that shift could escape. 259 of them died before the fire was contained. The disaster was so devastating and the working conditions so clearly dangerous that investigators who examined the aftermath pushed directly for legislative reform. The cherry mine fire became the direct cause of the first workers' compensation laws ever written in American history. 26. Illinois has over 900 documented wild plant species growing across its landscape, and botanists studying the state's ecology discovered that more than 200 of those species have no business being there at all. They arrived as stowaways inside the ballast water that foreign cargo ships pumped into the Great Lakes after crossing the Atlantic Ocean. Ships took on water in European ports, crossed the ocean, and released that water into the Great Lakes along with every seed, spore, and organism that had been quietly traveling inside it. 27. By 1844, the Mormon settlement of Nauvoo, Illinois, had grown so rapidly that it became the single largest city in the entire state, surpassing Chicago in population and establishing itself as a genuine center of commerce, religion, and political influence in the region. And then founder Joseph Smith was murdered by a mob in June of that year. The violence that followed was so sustained and so threatening that the entire Mormon population packed their belongings, abandoned every building they had constructed, and fled Nauvoo completely within 18 months of Smith's death. 28. George Washington Gale. Ferris Jr. arrived at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair Planning Committee with a proposal to build a massive spinning steel wheel 264 feet tall that would carry passengers in enclosed cars around its full rotation. Every bank he approached for financing looked at the blueprints, thought carefully about a giant spinning metal wheel full of people, and declined. Ferris eventually funded the entire construction himself. The wheel worked perfectly, carried over 1.5 million passengers during the fair, and every Ferris wheel built since carries his name. 29. Illinois legislators sat through a single session and passed over 3,000 individual pieces of legislation before going home. Researchers studying the session afterward surveyed the legislators themselves and found that the majority openly admitted they had not read more than 30% of the bills they personally voted to approve. Laws governing taxation, land use, criminal penalties, and public safety were passed by elected officials who, by their own admission, had no idea what they had just agreed to put into the legal code of Illinois. 30. Southern Illinois exists in a cultural universe completely separate from the city of Chicago, despite both being contained within the exact same state borders. Residents of the southern counties speak with a recognizable Southern American accent, follow cultural traditions aligned with rural Kentucky and Tennessee, and will tell any visitor directly that they feel no meaningful connection to Chicago or anything associated with it. Chicago is approximately 300 miles north, and might as well be a different country entirely as far as Southern Illinois is concerned. 31. Dan Walker decided the best way to win the Illinois governorship in 1972 was to walk across the entire state on foot, covering 1,197 miles through summer heat and autumn cold to show voters he was a genuine man of the people who understood their struggles firsthand. Voters believed him, elected him, and Walker took office as governor of Illinois. Several years after leaving office, he was convicted of bank fraud and went to federal prison, which is a very different kind of walk than the one that got him elected. 32. Chicago's murder rate in 1929 had climbed so high and Al Capone's operation had grown so untouchable that federal investigators made a strategic decision to stop trying to prove murder charges and hand the case to accountants instead. Detectives had spent years building cases that kept falling apart. Accountants spent a fraction of that time examining Capone's tax returns, found income he had never reported to the government, and built a case so straightforward that Capone went to prison for tax evasion, while the murder charges never had to be proven at all. 33. The town of Oblong. Illinois has a law in its books making it specifically and explicitly illegal to make love while hunting or fishing on your wedding day. Not hunting in general. Not fishing in general. Your wedding day specifically. Legal historians who have examined the ordinance note that the level of specificity required to write this law strongly suggest that a real incident occurred, was witnessed by enough people to become a community concern, and forced local lawmakers to sit down and formally address what they had seen. 34. Miles Davis was born in 1926 in Alton, Illinois, a small Mississippi River town that had no significant jazz scene, no music industry infrastructure, and no particular reason to produce one of the most influential musicians in American history. Davis left Illinois, moved to New York, studied at Juilliard, and went on to record albums that permanently changed the direction of jazz, rock, and popular music simultaneously. Alton, Illinois produced the greatest jazz musician who ever lived and remains one of the quietest towns on the Mississippi River. 35. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871 burned for 2 days, destroyed over 17,000 buildings, killed hundreds of people, and left a third of the city homeless before it was finally contained. Investigators needed someone to blame and settled on a story about a cow belonging to a woman named Catherine O'Leary, kicking over a lantern in her barn and starting the whole thing. The story spread across every newspaper in the country. Decades later, the reporter who originally wrote it admitted he had invented the cow detail entirely because his editor wanted a more interesting story. 36. So Illinois sits directly above the New Madrid seismic zone, one of the most geologically active fault systems in North America. And in the winter of 1811, that fault reminded everyone it existed by producing an earthquake of such extraordinary magnitude that the Mississippi River appeared to reverse its flow and run backwards for several hours before returning to normal. Witnesses on the riverbank described watching the water surge upstream. Scientists studying the event afterward confirmed the reversal was real and that the quake was among the most powerful ever recorded on the continent. 37. See, Illinois state legislators looked at the dome sitting on top of their state capitol building in Springfield and made a deliberate architectural decision that the dome needed to be physically larger and heavier than the dome on the United States Capitol building in Washington, D.C. Engineers drew up the plans accordingly. Construction proceeded as directed. The Illinois State Capitol dome was completed, and it is measurably and officially heavier than the federal dome. State legislators apparently felt this settled something important and have never been particularly subtle about it since. 38. A doctor named Bernard Fantis was working at Cook County Hospital in Chicago in 1937 when he noticed that donated blood collected for transfusions was routinely being discarded after each use because nobody had established any system for preserving and storing it between patients. Fantis realized the blood could be refrigerated and kept viable for future transfusions if handled correctly. He built the storage system, tested it, proved it worked, and established the first blood bank in American history. Every blood bank operating anywhere in the world today traces its origin directly to that Chicago hospital. 39. Illinois state government once continued sending a full regular salary by direct payment to an employee for 11 consecutive years after that employee had died. The payments processed automatically, cleared without review, and deposited reliably into an account while auditors reviewed other matters entirely. Nobody flagged the account. Nobody cross-referenced the payroll against death records. The payments only stopped arriving when a family member of the deceased employee contacted the state to ask why checks kept showing up addressed to someone who had been dead for over a decade. 40. Chicago has an underground pedestrian walkway system called the Pedway that connects buildings across more than 40 city blocks through a network of heated tunnels running beneath the streets. It was built specifically to allow residents and workers to move through the city during brutal Illinois winters without stepping outside into the cold. The system has existed for decades, appears on official city maps, and the majority of people who have lived and worked in Chicago for years have never once walked through it, or even known with certainty where the entrance is located. 41. Illinois Governor Otto Kerner had a reputation clean enough that a sitting United States president considered him trustworthy and appointed him to serve as a federal judge, one of the most respected positions in the American legal system. Kerner accepted the appointment, put on the robes, and took his seat on the federal bench. Investigators eventually caught up with him anyway, and Kerner became the first federal judge in American history convicted of bribery, a crime he had committed while serving as the governor who had been considered honest enough to become a judge. 42. The forgotten underground freight tunnels running beneath Chicago's downtown streets flooded catastrophically in April of 1992 when a construction crew working on a different project entirely accidentally drove a pile through the tunnel wall near the Chicago River. Water began pouring in immediately and traveled through 60 miles of interconnected tunnels before flooding into the basements of hundreds of buildings across the entire downtown core. Businesses shut down for weeks. Marshall Field's, the Chicago Board of Trade, and City Hall all lost power. The city had forgotten the tunnels existed until the tunnels reminded everyone simultaneously. 43. Illinois passed a law requiring that any moving vehicle on a public road must be operated by a licensed driver sitting in the operator's position, and which sounds like the kind of obvious rule that should not need to be written down until you discover the specific incident that actually inspired it. A man in Illinois had trained his dog to grip and steer the wheel while the man himself operated the foot pedals from the passenger seat. The arrangement worked well enough that they drove together regularly until someone official noticed, and the legislature felt compelled to formally respond. 44. Betty White was born on January 17, 1922 in Oak Park, Illinois, a quiet suburb sitting just outside Chicago that also produced Ernest Hemingway, and apparently has a remarkable track record of generating people destined to become American legends. White went on to work continuously in American television for over 80 years, appearing in productions across every decade from the 1940s through the 2010s, and became the longest-running female television entertainer in the history of the medium. Oak Park produced her and then watched her outlast virtually every institution she ever worked for. 45. The 1968 Democratic National Convention was held in Chicago during one of the most politically volatile summers in American history, and the chaos that erupted outside the convention hall became its own separate historical event. Thousands of protesters gathered in Grant Park, while police responded with a level of force that shocked the entire country watching on television. A government commission was assembled afterward to officially determine what had occurred during those nights in Chicago. The commission reviewed the evidence and formally declared that what happened was not a riot. It was a police riot. 46. Illinois has almost no natural lakes of any meaningful size within its borders, despite being home to one of the most lake-dependent cities in America. Every body of water that Chicago residents use for swimming, boating, and recreation was either artificially constructed at some point or is technically a portion of Lake Michigan, which Illinois only has access to because a politician named Nathaniel Pope quietly lobbied Congress in 1818 to move the state's northern border 51 miles further north before anyone finalized the maps and made the boundary permanent. 47. The miners working inside the Centralia No. 5 coal mine in Illinois were frightened enough about the conditions surrounding them that they did something extraordinary in 1946. They wrote a formal letter addressed directly to the governor of Illinois describing the dangerous buildup of explosive coal dust inside the mine, and ending with a direct and desperate request asking him to please save their lives before something catastrophic happened. The governor received the letter, filed it, and never meaningfully responded. In 1947, an explosion killed 111 men inside that exact mine. 48. Before the Great Chicago Fire destroyed the city in 1871, there was no building code governing construction anywhere in Chicago or in virtually any other American city. Builders used whatever materials were cheapest and most available. To constructed buildings, however, they personally decided was appropriate, and nobody with official authority reviewed or approved any of it. After the fire burned through 17,000 structures in 2 days, investigators sat down and wrote the first unified building code in American history, establishing for the first time that someone needed to decide what cities could legally be built from. 49. Illinois state legislators scheduled a late session vote in 2003 and called it at 2 in the morning when public attention was at its lowest, and journalists covering the state house had largely gone home for the evening. The legislators present voted to approve a significant pay raise for themselves, believed the timing meant nobody would notice, and went home satisfied. The raise was discovered, reported, and became front-page news across the country within days. The legislators who thought 2 in the morning was invisible learned that someone is always still watching in Illinois. 50. Chicago's Magnificent Mile stretches through the heart of the city and contains more flagship retail stores packed into a single strip than Fifth Avenue in New York City, which is universally recognized as one of the great shopping destinations on the planet. More Americans buy clothing on the Magnificent Mile every single year than buy clothing in Paris during the same period. Chicago has dressed more of the country than most European fashion capitals combined. The global fashion industry has never once acknowledged this, and Chicago has never quite figured out how to make them 51. Signed, an Illinois state treasurer serving in the 1950s discovered that his position gave him access to significant public funds and made a personal decision about what to do with that access. He quietly moved money into a private account, covered the transfers well enough that routine audits missed them completely, and left the stolen funds sitting in that account long enough that the money began generating its own interest income. By the time investigators finally found the account, the stolen public funds had been privately earning interest for over a decade, and the total had grown considerably beyond the original amount taken. 52. Chicago O'Hare Airport was handling enormous volumes of commercial passenger flights, processing thousands of travelers daily. seeing and operating as one of the busiest aviation hubs in the entire country when federal officials looked at their official maps and noticed something unusual. O'Hare was still formally classified on federal documents as an active military airfield. The classification had never been updated after the airport transitioned to commercial use. Millions of civilian passengers had been flying in and out of a facility that the United States government was officially still listing as a military installation until the paperwork was finally corrected in 1959. 53. The village of Kenilworth. Illinois established an ordinance making it formally illegal for any rooster to crow within the village limits during early morning hours before residents have had a reasonable opportunity to wake up naturally. The rooster owners living inside Kenilworth are legally required to keep their birds contained and quiet before sunrise or face an official fine for the disturbance. The ordinance means that anyone in Kenilworth who wants to raise chickens must also solve the specific problem of explaining to a rooster that Illinois municipal law applies to him personally every single morning. 54. Ernest Hemingway was born in Oak Park, Illinois in 1899, grew up walking its carefully maintained streets, attended its schools, and left as soon as he reasonably could. Years later, after becoming one of the most celebrated writers in American history, Hemingway described his hometown publicly as a place of wide lawns and narrow minds, a pointed assessment that the residents of Oak Park took personally. The town eventually decided the quote was famous enough to deserve recognition anyway, had it printed onto a historical plaque, and installed that plaque in a place where visitors could read Hemingway insulting them in his own words. 55. The Pullman Strike of 1894 began at the company town of Pullman outside Chicago, when workers building railroad cars had their wages cut without any corresponding reduction in the rent they were required to pay to live in company-owned housing. The strike spread faster than anyone anticipated, and within weeks had shut down railroad traffic across 27 states simultaneously, paralyzing freight and passenger movement across the entire country. President Grover Cleveland watched the country grind to a halt, called in federal troops to end it, and then rushed to establish Labor Day as an official federal holiday specifically to demonstrate sympathy for American workers. 56. The Mississippi River forms the entire western boundary of Illinois and has done so since the state was first established, but the border has never been as stable as a line on a map suggests. The river moves. It shifts its channel, cuts new paths through soft soil, deposits sediment on one bank and erodes the other. And every time it does, Illinois either gains or loses actual physical land. The state's western border is a living document that rewrites itself every time the Mississippi decides to move, and lawyers have been arguing about the implications ever since. 57. A funeral procession was crossing a bridge in Meridosia, Illinois in 1929 when the bridge structure gave way beneath the weight of the vehicles and collapsed directly into the water below. Everyone involved survived the collapse without fatal injury, which under the circumstances was remarkable. Local residents examined what had happened, thought carefully about the location, decided the site had demonstrated something meaningful about its intentions, and refused to support the construction of any replacement bridge at that exact spot for over 12 years afterward. The river crossing sat unrepaired, while locals used alternate routes rather than tempt whatever they believed was happening at that location. 58. Chicago's ground in the 1880s was too soft and too unstable to support the kind of large, heavy masonry buildings that architects wanted to construct, as the city grew rapidly outward in every direction. Engineers needed a solution and arrived at one that had never been seriously attempted before at commercial scale. They designed a building frame made of steel that could carry its own weight internally, rather than relying on thick masonry walls for support. The home insurance building rose 10 stories in 1885, became the first true skyscraper in human history, and established the construction principle that every tall building anywhere in the world has used since. 59. Illinois legislators gathered for a routine session and were presented with what their staff described as a standard congratulatory resolution. So the kind of ceremonial document that gets passed dozens of times per session to honor local achievements and community milestones. Members reviewed it briefly, voted to approve it without significant debate, and moved on to other business. Investigators examining the session afterward discovered that the document was not a congratulatory resolution at all. It was a complete rewrite of significant portions of Illinois state water law, and every legislator in the room had just voted to change it without reading a single paragraph. 60. Springfield, Illinois, is the preserved and federally protected historic hometown of Abraham Lincoln, containing his carefully maintained home, his law office, his presidential library, and the tomb where he is buried, all existing as solemn reminders of the most significant figure in American political history. Springfield is also home to a casino operating within comfortable walking distance of Lincoln's National Historic Site, a Hooters restaurant visible from the historic district, and a Walmart positioned close enough that Lincoln's federally protected neighborhood and a big box retail parking lot essentially share the same horizon line. 61. Illinois Governor William Stratton found himself sitting in a federal courtroom facing tax evasion charges after investigators discovered he had been spending campaign funds on personal luxuries and lifestyle expenses that had nothing to do with running for office or governing the state. His legal team reviewed the evidence, assessed the situation, and arrived at a defense strategy that was either brilliant or deeply revealing depending on your perspective. They successfully argued that a politician spending campaign money on personal comforts was simply standard accepted political behavior in Illinois. The jury heard the argument, considered it carefully, and acquitted him. 62. Zion, Illinois has a municipal ordinance sitting formally on its books making it explicitly and specifically illegal to give a lit cigar to any dog, cat, or other domesticated animal within city limits. Legal historians examining unusual American ordinances have noted repeatedly that laws written with this level of operational specificity are almost never created in a vacuum. Someone in Zion witnessed a lit cigar being given to a domesticated animal and found the experience troubling enough to bring it to local government, and enough elected officials agreed that formal legislative action was the appropriate response to what they had been told. 63. Carl Sandburg was born in Galesburg, Illinois, in 1878 and grew up in a small prairie town with no particular literary reputation or cultural infrastructure that would suggest it was producing anyone destined for greatness. Sandburg eventually wrote the single most famous description of Chicago ever committed to the English language, calling it the city of big shoulders, in a poem that Chicago residents adopted immediately and have quoted proudly ever since. The man who defined Chicago for the world was from Galesburg, had no Chicago roots whatsoever, and became more famous than most of the city's own celebrated native sons. Arc 64. Illinois holds the historical distinction of being the very first state in the entire United States to officially ratify the 13th Amendment to the Constitution in February of 1865, moving faster than every other state to put its formal approval on the document abolishing slavery across the country. Illinois legislators signed the ratification, celebrated the moment, and returned home to a state that simultaneously maintained its own collection of black codes, a set of laws restricting the legal rights, movement, and opportunities of black residents living inside Illinois, that remained active on the state's own books for decades after the amendment was signed. 65. So, the original surveyed northern border of Illinois was drawn in a position that would have placed the future site of Chicago entirely within the boundaries of Wisconsin. Every geographic and political advantage that came with Lake Michigan access, every shipping route, every trade connection, and every economic opportunity that built Chicago into one of the greatest cities in America would have belonged to a completely different state. The only reason Illinois has any of it is that one man named Nathaniel Pope walked into Congress in 1818 and quietly asked them to move the line 51 miles north before anyone finalized the maps. 66. George Pullman built his company town outside Chicago in 1880 with genuine ambition and a sincere belief that providing workers with clean housing, paved streets, a library, and a church would create a stable and contented workforce that would never have reason to organize or protest. He named the entire town after himself, owned every building in it, and required every resident to rent from him while working for him simultaneously. Within 14 years, the workers whose contentment he had been so confident about launched the largest and most disruptive labor uprising in American history, and the United States Army had to occupy the town to end it. 67. The zipper was invented in the late 1800s, but spent decades as a theoretical device that clothing manufacturers across America refused to adopt for commercial use because they believed customers would find the mechanism too complicated to operate reliably during daily dressing routines. A Chicago-based operation eventually took the patent seriously. I refined the mechanism and began pushing it into the market in the early 20th century. Manufacturers resisted for another 20 years. The zipper eventually won, appeared on everything from boots to jackets to luggage, and the clothing industry that spent 2 decades calling it too complicated now cannot function without it. 68. Illinois state officers arrived at the State House in Springfield carrying a formal legal arrest warrant for a sitting member of the state legislature who had active criminal charges filed against him. The situation became immediately complicated when officers discovered that the legislator was not outside the building or in his office or anywhere easily accessible. He was physically present inside the State House chamber, seated among his fellow legislators, actively participating in the session that was currently underway. Officers stood at the chamber door holding the warrant, while constitutional lawyers scrambled to figure out whether they were legally allowed to walk in and serve it. 69. Illinois has a town incorporated under the official name Normal, which sits in McLean County and has existed under that name since 1865 without any apparent irony intended by its founders. Researchers and statisticians who study demographic averages across American communities have examined Normal, Illinois multiple times over the decades and keep arriving at the same finding. The town measures as one of the most statistically average communities in the entire United States across income levels, education rates, and demographic composition. See, it is as if someone calculated exactly what an average American town should look like, and then built Normal on purpose to match the result. 70. Illinois has a pension obligation crisis so financially severe and so deeply embedded in the state's legal structure that the Illinois Supreme Court reviewed the situation, examined the state constitution, and issued a ruling confirming that Illinois cannot legally reduce its pension commitments to public employees, even if doing so is the only available option for preventing a complete state financial collapse. The court was not offering an opinion or a suggestion. It was stating a legal fact. Illinois is constitutionally prohibited from escaping the financial hole it spent decades digging and has no legal mechanism available to climb out of it. 71. Illinois has sent 4 governors to federal prison, passed laws it never read, paid a dead employee for 11 years, built a prison it never opened, and accidentally rewrote its own water law without noticing. It produced Abraham Lincoln, Ernest Hemingway, Ronald Reagan, and Betty White, in the same state that also produced Rod Blagojevich, who made incriminating phone calls on a wiretapped line every single day like a man who had simply never heard the word wiretap. Illinois is the most uniquely and completely itself place in America, and it has never once apologized for a single thing it has done. And that was Illinois, a state that sent 4 governors to prison and still kept electing more. Which fact completely destroyed you the most? Drop it in the comments right now. If you enjoyed this, hit subscribe to Dumbest Things. See you smash that like button, and we will see you in the next one where another state has serious explaining to do.